Hey boys and girls. So this is the last video you're going to have to watch of me for math for the school year. So I guess if you're getting really tired of me, then you don't have to watch me every day. And if you miss me, you could always rewatch my math videos and do math over and over again. I'm sure you guys would love to do that. I'm just kidding. Okay, so today we're going to start on page 539. Okay? So there's something important that you need to know for this section. Remember, Mrs. Alder and I just want to kind of show you this decimal stuff because you're going to see it in 5th grade. But if you're not super comfortable with it after these lessons, that's okay. All right? We don't expect you to be experts. That's why we're not giving you the comprehension check or anything. We're just having you practice it and do the blue eye readies and just give it a shot, okay? So that way when you go into 5th grade, you're like, oh, I kind of remember I saw this before, okay? So I want to tell you that when you're talking about place value for decimals, remember, before the decimal, we would have hundreds, tens, ones, okay? Then after the decimal, it goes tenths, hundredths, then we're going to get into later next year, thousandths. The difference is it has that TH on the end, so it makes it really hard for you to say. So if you see a TH on the end, that means it comes after the decimal. And the order it goes is decimal point, tenths, hundredths, okay? So just like when we looked at those 100 grids, you're going to have tenths, right? That's when you can fill in the whole bar. And then if you only have some cubes that can't fit into a tenth, these are your hundredths, okay? So let's jump into the problem. It says a soccer camp has places for 100 students. So far, 60 of the places are filled. Write both a fraction and a decimal in both hundredths and tenths to show the part of the 100 places for the students that are filled. Okay, so first let's write our fraction because we're more familiar with that. So it says there's 60 of the places are filled. 60 out of how many, guys? 60 out of 100. I know when I write a fraction, the bar means out of, right? So if I have 60 out of 100, okay? It wants me to write that as tenths too. So this is in the hundredths format. If I wanted to write it as tenths, I could think about if I cover up those zeros, what is left? This is equal to 6 tenths, right? Those are the same. So I could either say the soccer camp has 60 hundredths filled up, or I could say 6 tenths, okay? Those are the fractions that represent it. Now, this is how I would write it as a decimal. So if I'm thinking of this chart that I wrote, there are no ones because there's no whole numbers, right? This number is less than 1. So I would put a 0 before the decimal. I would go 0, decimal. Now when we write a decimal, we say and, okay? If you have Mrs. Jones next year, you'll never forget that because she always reminds you it's and instead of decimal or point, okay? Some people say point, but you're supposed to say and. So 0 and, so we can write this as tenths or hundredths. So if we want to write it as tenths, we would write 0 and 6 tenths. So if I pop this in my thing up here, I would have 0 and 6 tenths. That's the same as that, okay? If I wanted to write it as 60 hundredths, I would have 0 and 60 hundredths, okay? If I'm talking about hundredths, it needs to go all the way over into the hundredths place value. So I could also write my decimal as this, 0 and 60 hundredths is what I would say. Okay, so I just want you to know this says 0 and 6 tenths. This says 0 and 60 hundredths. Okay? Let's take a look at the next page. 540. So this is the same problem, and it's showing us, okay? Just explaining it a little bit, breaking it down. So it says you can represent the model as the places that are filled, okay? So it shows you here, this is it in hundredths, this is it in tenths, okay? So it's showing you in hundredths, 60 of the squares are shaded. So that means, can't really see this, huh? It would be 0 and 60 hundredths of the whole is shaded. Or you could look at it as tenths. 6 of the tenths are shaded, right? So it'd be 0 and 6 tenths of the whole is shaded, okay? Just like we talked about, it shows you in this place value chart here. Remember, it goes and for the decimal, tenths, hundredths, okay? Now on 541, it says we're going to be using the problem from the previous page, okay? So the model on the left shows 60 squares shaded. Write the fraction for that model, okay? So we're kind of getting good at this now. We know that 60 out of how many? It's out of 100, right? So we have 60 hundredths is our fraction. What fraction does this show in the next one? Well, there's 10 equal parts. How many of the parts are shaded? 6, right? So that's showing 6 tenths. It says, how does the model on the right show the fraction you wrote for the model in problem 1? So, just like we wrote before for the first problem, this shows 6 tenths, right? Sometimes this stuff is so repetitive. I'm going to skip that one. Well, let's just write 6 tenths, okay? That's the fraction it shows. Look at the place value chart right here and write the decimal in tenths and the equivalent decimal in hundredths, okay? So if we wanted to write it as tenths, we would write 0 and 6 tenths. If we wanted to write it as hundredths, we would write 0 and 60 hundredths, okay? The reason why this is tenths is because the tenths place value only goes to 1 after the decimal, right? This has one number after the decimal, which means it's tenths. The hundredths place value goes 2 after the decimal, 1, 2. So this goes 2 after the decimal, that's why it's 60 hundredths, okay? Look at number 4. Write a number on each line to describe how the decimals relate to the fractions. So if the denominator of a fraction is 10, the equivalent decimal has to be blank place after the decimal point. Okay, so if we're talking about tenths here, guys, the number is going to be 1 place after the decimal. So that's going to be 1. If we're talking about hundredths, how many places after the decimal? 1, 2, right? So that's going to be 2 places after the decimal. Number 5, we're going to skip. Moving on to page 542. Let's look at number 6. Write a decimal equivalent to 2 tenths. Draw the model that shows the fraction and the decimal. Show your work. So, 2 tenths. Let's first of all draw the model. So, in the model we need to do a big square. And we have to divide it into 10 equal parts. So I'm going to divide it in half, and I'm going to divide each of these into 5. It's going to be kind of tough to draw, but just try your best, guys. Okay, so that's 10, right? And now how many of these do we need to shade in? How many out of 10? 2. Okay. Then I need to write it as a decimal. So I have 2 tenths. So for this, I'm also going to write my little ones and tenths, okay? So I want you to do this. Ones, just put a line down, and put a line down, tenths. You can put a line underneath too to make it neater. Okay, that's how it's going to go. We know our and means decimal, so we're going to put that in. Now, do we have any ones? Are there any whole numbers? No, this is only a part of a whole, right? So the 0 ones. And how many tenths are there, guys? 2, right? 2. So your solution is going to be 0 and 2 tenths. That's how you say it. All right? All right. Let's look here down at number 7. I like to use this chart for now while we're getting used to it. So I'm going to write my chart. I know I need to go up to hundredths, okay? Because I'm looking for a decimal that's equivalent to 83 hundredths. So I'm going to write ones, line, and line. Tenths, hundredths. Okay? This is my chart, my place value chart. The first part's easy. I already know and means decimal, right? Now it's 83 hundredths. That's less than 1. So are there any ones? No. No 1. So it's 0. And now we have to write in how many hundredths are there. So it's 83 hundredths. In 83 hundredths, guys, there's 8 tenths, and then there's 3 hundredths, okay? So remember, when we're thinking about a chart like this, we're not going to put 2 numbers in the same box, right? So you make sure you do 8 in the tenths, 3 in the hundredths. Now, since this decimal goes all the way to the hundredths box, I say it like 0 and 83 hundredths, okay? If you wanted to rewrite it nice and neatly, you could write 0 and 83 hundredths, okay? Last problem. Write the mixed number 7 and 9 tenths as a decimal, okay? So I'm going to use my chart again. So I know I'm going to need to go up to tenths. So I'm going to have ones and tenths. Okay. How many, okay, first of all, I already know and is a decimal, right? How many ones are there? In this case, we do have some wholes, right? When I look at a mixed number, the big number is the wholes, right? How many wholes are there? 7. There's 7 wholes. And how many tenths? 9. 9 tenths, right? So if I write this nice and neatly, 7 and 9 tenths. All right, guys, so that's a wrap for that lesson. Make sure you finish up your blue eye ready and that you get a green light on reflex. That concludes my math videos for the year of 2020. I hope you guys liked them. I liked making them for you. Talk to you later.